Have you ever had a seemingly normal day or night take a chilling turn into something straight out of a nightmare? Some encounters leave us with questions that will never be answered, and some places leave us with memories we wish we could forget. Tonight, on Nightmare Narratives, we dive into two unsettling stories that will make you think twice about the roads you travel and the people you trust. New Year's Eve. For most, it's a night of celebration, laughter, and new beginnings. A night where people gather with friends and family to toast to the promise of a brighter tomorrow. But for me, that particular New Year's Eve became a memory I'll never escape. What started as an ordinary drive to a friend's party turned into a night of terror I can never fully explain. I live on the outskirts of a small southern town, a place where time feels like it's moving slower than the rest of the world. It's the kind of town where everyone knows each other, where gossip spreads faster than wildfire, and where life is simple, almost too simple. But there's something about small towns that people don't often talk about. The deeper you go, the lonelier and more unsettling they become. My friend Darren's family lives in one of those secluded neighborhoods on the very edge of town. Their house is nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense woods, accessible only by a series of winding, narrow country roads. These roads are the kind that seem to stretch on forever, with sharp turns and steep dips that make you feel like you're driving into the unknown. Every year, Darren's family hosts a big New Year's Eve party. It's a tradition that brings together friends, neighbors, and even a few distant relatives. The party is always lively, filled with laughter, music, and enough food to feed an army. When the formal invitation arrived in the mail, as it always did, I didn't hesitate to RSVP. The weather leading up to New Year's had been unusual. Winters in the South are rarely predictable, but this year was particularly strange. The days leading up to the event had been unseasonably warm, almost balmy. Then, just a few days before New Year's, a sudden cold front swept through, dropping temperatures to near freezing. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, the air was bitterly cold, and the frost-covered ground crunched underfoot. I left my house just as the sun was setting. The drive to Darren's house was familiar. Too familiar, perhaps. The back roads that led to his neighborhood were the kind that could make even the most confident driver feel uneasy. They were narrow, barely wide enough for two cars to pass, and lined with dense trees that seemed to close in on you the farther you went. As I navigated the twists and turns, I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and the only light came from my car's high beams, which cut a narrow path through the shadowy woods. Normally I avoided using my high beams. I hated blinding other drivers, but on these roads they were a necessity. Without them I felt like I was driving blind. About halfway to Darren's house, I passed the only structure on that road, an old weathered shack that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The first time I'd driven past it, years ago, I'd felt an inexplicable sense of dread. The shack was barely standing, its roof sagging under the weight of time, and its windows boarded up with planks of rotting wood. It was the kind of place that made you instinctively lock your doors and press a little harder on the gas pedal. But there was something else about that shack, something that didn't make sense. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of light coming from inside, a faint flickering glow that spilled out through the cracks in the boards. It wasn't the warm, inviting light of a home. It was cold, almost unnatural, like the glow of a dying bulb. That night, as I approached the shack, I instinctively slowed down. There it was again, the light. It flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a figure perhaps, passing in front of the light, but when I blinked, it was gone. I shook off the unease and pressed on, the gravel crunching under my tires as I picked up speed. The road ahead was long and straight, a rare stretch of clarity in the otherwise winding path. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a pale blur among the shadows, something that could easily be mistaken for a patch of fog or a reflection. But as I got closer, the shape became clearer, a figure standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of my headlights. My heart skipped a beat as my high beams illuminated her. It was a woman, wearing a long white gown that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. She stood perfectly still, her back to the forest, her arms hanging limply at her sides. The sight of her was so unexpected, so out of place, that I instinctively slowed down. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as my mind raced with questions. Who was she? What was she doing out here, in the middle of nowhere, on a freezing night like this? I inched closer, my headlights casting harsh light on her figure. The gown she wore looked old-fashioned, almost like something out of a different era. It was thin, too thin for the weather, and it clung to her frame as if it had been soaked in water. Her hair was long and tangled, cascading down her back in messy waves. I couldn't see her face. She didn't turn to look at me, didn't acknowledge my car at all. She just stood there, motionless, like a statue carved from marble. For a moment I considered stopping. What if she needed help? What if she was lost or hurt? But something about her presence felt wrong. There was an unnatural stillness to her, a sense of detachment from the world around her. It was as if she didn't belong here, not on this road, not in this time. As I passed her, I glanced in my rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. She had turned. Her head was facing the road now, her body still frozen, but her face following my car as it moved away. The red glow of my taillights illuminated her faintly, and for a split second, I thought I saw her smile. A chill ran down my spine, and I pressed down on the gas pedal, eager to put as much distance between us as possible. I told myself it was nothing, just a strange coincidence. Maybe she was a local, or a guest heading to the same party, but deep down, I knew better. When I finally reached Darren's house, the sight of the warm, glowing windows and the sound of laughter spilling out into the night was a welcome relief. I parked my car in the gravel driveway and tried to shake off the unease that clung to me like a second skin. The party was everything I'd expected, fun, lively, and full of familiar faces. We drank, laughed, and counted down to midnight, cheering as the clock struck 12. For a few hours I forgot about the woman in white, lost in the joy of the celebration. But as the night wore on and guests began to head home, the memory of her came back, creeping into the corners of my mind. By the time I stepped outside to leave, the festive warmth of the party had faded, replaced by the cold, silent night. Most of the other cars were gone, and mine sat alone in the driveway, its windows fogged from the frost. When I started the engine, a warning light blinked on the dashboard, low tire pressure. I frowned, but it wasn't unusual. My car was old, and the sudden temperature drop could have caused the tires to deflate slightly. Still, as I pulled out of the driveway and onto the dark road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shadows seemed darker now, the silence heavier. My high beams carved a narrow path through the darkness, but beyond their reach, the forest loomed like a black wall. A few minutes into the drive, the sound started, a low metallic scraping that seemed to come from underneath the car. I slowed down, the noise growing louder with every turn of the wheels. My heart sank. I pulled over and stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. The road was empty, the forest around me silent except for the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I crouched down to inspect the tires, and what I saw made my stomach drop. All 4 tires were shredded, the rubber torn apart as if by claws. It didn't make sense. How could all 4 tires have been damaged at once? Before I could make sense of it, I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves coming from the darkness of the trees. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends. Let's see how many of them can handle the chills. The sound of footsteps on the leaves was unmistakable. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. But as I stood frozen beside my car, gripping the flashlight in one trembling hand, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving with purpose. I turned slowly, the flashlight's beam cutting through the dense darkness of the surrounding forest. The trees loomed like skeletal sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out as if trying to ensnare me. The cold air pressed in around me, sharp and biting, making every breath visible as a cloud of white mist. "Hello?" My voice cracked as it left my throat, shaky and uncertain. The word echoed briefly before being swallowed by the oppressive silence of the woods. No response. A part of me wanted to believe it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon startled by the sudden intrusion of my car. But deep down, I knew better. The sound was too deliberate, too calculated. It wasn't the random scurry of a creature moving through the underbrush. It was human. The beam of the flashlight wavered as I scanned the area, my hands trembling. The forest was eerily still, the kind of stillness that made your skin crawl. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, leaving the trees motionless and silent. I took a cautious step back toward my car, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. But just as my hand reached for the door handle, the footsteps came again. This time they were faster, heavier, as if whoever was out there had decided to close the distance. I spun around, the flashlight darting wildly through the trees. And then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. Her white gown seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, its fabric fluttering slightly as if caught in a non-existent breeze. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her posture was unmistakable, rigid, unnatural, as though she were a doll propped up in the woods. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. She didn't move. The flashlight's beam steadied as I focused it on her, illuminating the pale, gaunt features of her face. Her hollow eyes seemed to pierce through me, and her lips were set in a faint, unreadable expression. A smile, perhaps, though it didn't reach her eyes. I stood there, paralyzed by fear, my mind racing with questions. Who was she? What was she doing out here in the middle of nowhere, dressed like that? And why did she feel so wrong? Then, without warning, she moved. It wasn't a natural movement. It was jerky, abrupt, as if she had been yanked forward by invisible strings. One moment she was standing still, and the next she was closer, too close. Panic surged through me, breaking the paralysis that had gripped my body. I turned and lunged for the car door, yanking it open and throwing myself inside. My hands fumbled with the keys as I tried to start the engine, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The car roared to life, and I didn't waste a second slamming my foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the gravel as the car lurched forward, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkness. But as I sped down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows darting between the trees just beyond the reach of my headlights. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes flicking between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. And then I saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road, directly in my path. Her gown billowed around her as if caught in an invisible wind, and her face was wrong. Her hollow eyes stared straight at me, unblinking, and her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin that sent a chill down my spine. I swerved violently, the tires skidding on the icy road. The car fishtailed before I regained control, my heart racing as I glanced back in the rearview mirror. She was gone. I didn't stop. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep going, to put as much distance between myself and that road as possible. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching, waiting. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning through the forest like a serpent. The trees pressed closer, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers, and the darkness grew thicker with every passing second. And then, just as I thought I might finally be safe, the car abruptly jerked to a stop. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me in complete silence. The headlights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the road into darkness. "No, no, no," I whispered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. But the car wouldn't start. It was as if the life had been drained from it, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel and trying to steady my breathing. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. And then I heard it. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, and drawing closer. I locked the doors, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone. I held it up, praying for a signal, but the screen remained blank. No bars, no hope. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside the car. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the windshield. And then she appeared. Her face was inches from the glass, her hollow eyes staring directly into mine. Her lips parted, and I heard her voice, a soft, chilling whisper that seemed to echo inside my head. "I see you," I screamed, scrambling to the passenger side of the car. My hand found the door handle, and before I could think, I pushed it open and bolted into the forest. The cold air stung my lungs as I ran, branches scratching at my face and arms. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. But no matter how fast I ran, the sound of her footsteps followed, relentless and unyielding. "Stop running," her voice called out, soft and almost playful. "You can't hide from me." I didn't stop. I couldn't. My legs burned, my breath came in ragged gasps, but I kept going, weaving through the trees as the darkness closed in around me. Finally, I saw it. A faint light in the distance. Darren's house. I stumbled toward it, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. The sound of her footsteps grew fainter, but I didn't dare look back. When I reached the house, I pounded on the door, my fist slamming against the wood. "Help me!" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. The door flew open, and Darren's mother stood there, her face pale with concern. She pulled me inside, locking the door behind me as I collapsed onto the floor. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. But I couldn't answer. All I could do was sit there, shaking as the faint sound of footsteps echoed in my ears. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this chilling encounter. Darren's mother helped me to my feet, her hands firm but trembling slightly as she steadied me. I was shaking so badly that my knees felt like they could give out at any moment. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and I clutched at the door frame for support, trying to ground myself in the reality of the moment. "What happened?" she asked again, her voice a mixture of concern and fear. Her eyes searched mine, desperate for an explanation. My voice faltered, my mouth dry. I didn't even know where to begin. "There's someone out there," I managed to say, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "A woman. She was on the road, and then she was at my car. She's following me." Darren's mother exchanged a worried glance with someone standing behind her. I turned to see Darren in the doorway of the living room, his face pale, his expression grim. He didn't say a word, just motioned for me to come inside. "Come in," he said softly, his voice steady, but laced with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or maybe resignation. The warmth of their home hit me like a wave as I crossed the threshold, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. The living room was cozy, with soft, worn furniture and a crackling fireplace casting a warm glow over the room. It should have felt safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was still out there, lurking just beyond the walls. Darren guided me to the couch, and I sank into it shakily. His mother handed me a glass of water, and I clutched it with both hands, trying to steady my trembling fingers. The water sloshed dangerously close to the rim as I brought it to my lips and took a small sip. "What did you see?" Darren asked as he sat across from me. His tone was calm, but his eyes were sharp, studying me intently. I hesitated, the image of the woman's hollow eyes and unnatural smile flashing in my mind. "She was pale," I began, my voice hoarse. "Her face, it was so thin, like she hadn't eaten in weeks. Her eyes were dark, empty, and her mouth—" I trailed off, shuddering as I remembered the way her lips had stretched into that awful, unnatural grin. Darren's mother gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Darren, however, didn't react right away. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and waited for me to continue. "She was wearing a white dress," I added, my voice trembling. "But it looked old, like something from another time. It was dirty, and it clung to her like she'd been in the water." Darren's mother crossed herself, murmuring something under her breath that I couldn't quite catch. Darren, however, held my gaze, his expression grim. "Did she say anything?" he asked after a moment. I nodded, my throat tightening as I recalled her chilling words. She said, "I see you." At that, Darren finally reacted. He exchanged a look with his mother, one that spoke volumes without a single word being said. "Darren," his mother whispered, her voice trembling, "it's her. It has to be." Darren didn't respond immediately. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face as if trying to suppress a wave of frustration, or maybe fear. "What's going on?" I demanded, looking between them. "Do you know who she is?" Darren hesitated, glancing at his mother before finally speaking. "There's a story," he said slowly, his voice low. "An old story about a woman who haunts these woods. They call her the Lady in White." "The Lady in White?" I repeated, the words sending a chill down my spine. Darren's mother nodded solemnly. "She's been seen by dozens of people over the years. she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Always on this stretch of road, always on nights like this. Some say she's the spirit of a bride who was abandoned at the altar, left to die of a broken heart. Others say she was murdered in the woods and buried in a shallow grave, her soul unable to rest. I stared at them in disbelief, my mind racing to process what I was hearing. You're telling me she's a ghost? That what I saw wasn't human? Darren's mother crossed herself again, her lips moving silently in prayer. Darren, however, held my gaze, his expression serious. I know how it sounds, he said. But trust me, you're not the first person to see her, and you won't be the last. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. Number. That's just a story. It's not real. It can't be real. Then how do you explain what you saw? Darren asked quietly. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I explain it? How could I make sense of something that defied all logic and reason? The room fell silent, the weight of their words pressing down on me like a physical force. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, its warm glow doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over me. Whatever she is, Darren's mother said finally, breaking the silence, she's dangerous. You're lucky you made it here. Not everyone does. Her words sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through me. I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see the woman's pale face staring back at me. The thought made my stomach churn. What do we do? I asked, my voice trembling. We wait until morning, Darren said firmly. She doesn't come out during the day. As long as we stay inside, we'll be safe. His mother nodded, though her expression remained troubled. But you have to be careful, she warned. She doesn't always stay outside. Sometimes she finds a way in. My heart sank at her words, and I found myself scanning the room for any potential points of entry. The windows were locked, the doors bolted, but the house suddenly felt far less secure. The room fell into an uneasy silence after Darren's mother's warning. I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me, a leaden sense of dread that made my chest feel tight. The thought that she might find a way into the house was almost too much to bear. Every creak of the old wooden floor, every rustle of the wind against the windows felt like an impending threat. Darren got up and began checking the locks on the windows and doors, his movements deliberate but tense. I watched him in silence, clutching the glass of water in my trembling hands. His mother crossed the room to light another candle, muttering what sounded like a prayer under her breath. Does this happen often? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Darren paused, his hand resting on the latch of a window. Not often, he said, but often enough. People around here know better than to be out on that road at night. Why didn't you warn me? I snapped, the fear in my voice giving way to anger. You knew I was coming. You could have said something. Darren turned to face me, his expression hard. Would you have believed me? He asked. Would you have turned back if I told you not to drive through the woods because of some ghost story? I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out. He was right. If I'd heard this story before tonight, I would have laughed it off as a local legend, just another campfire tale to scare tourists. But now, I wasn't so sure. Darren's mother sat down across from me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. It's not your fault, she said gently. You couldn't have known, but now that you've seen her, you need to be careful. She doesn't just let people go." "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach sinking. Darren's mother hesitated, glancing at her son. "She latches on to people. Once you've seen her, she doesn't forget you. She'll follow you. She'll try to get closer. And the more you let her in, the harder it is to escape." I shivered, pulling the blanket Darren had draped over me tighter around my shoulders. "How do you get rid of her?" I asked. "There has to be a way." Darren and his mother exchanged another look, and I could tell they were both reluctant to answer. Finally, Darren sighed and sat down beside me. "There's no one answer," he said. "Some people say you have to confront her, figure out what she wants. Others say you just have to wait her out, hope she loses interest. But—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "But what?" I pressed, my heart pounding. "She doesn't always stop," he admitted. "Some people disappear. They go looking for answers, and they never come back." The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. None of us slept. Darren stayed by the window, keeping watch, while his mother sat by the fire, flipping through an old leather-bound book that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with tiny handwritten notes in the margins. "What's that?" I asked, desperate for any distraction from the oppressive silence. "It's an old family journal," Darren's mother said without looking up. "It belonged to my grandmother. She used to tell stories about the lady in white when I was a little girl. I thought they were just bedtime tales to keep us out of the woods, but now—" She sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of a faded photograph tucked between the pages. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look. The photograph was black and white, faded with age, but I could just make out the image of a young woman in a long flowing dress. Her face was partially obscured by shadows, but there was something about her that felt eerily familiar. "Is that her?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Darren's mother hesitated, then nodded. "I think so," she said. "This photo was taken over 100 years ago, not far from here. My grandmother said the woman in the picture was named Eleanor. She was supposed to be married, but her fiancé left her at the altar. She disappeared the same night, and no one ever saw her again. Until now," Darren muttered from his post by the window. I stared at the photograph, a chill running down my spine. The woman in the picture didn't look exactly like the figure I'd seen on the road, but there was enough of a resemblance to make my skin crawl. Her hollow eyes, her haunting expression, it was all there, buried beneath the grainy texture of the old photograph. "Do you think she's trying to tell us something?" I asked hesitantly. "If she's a ghost, maybe she just wants someone to listen." Darren's mother shook her head. "Maybe," she said. "But if that's true, why does she hurt people? Why does she make them disappear?" "Not every spirit is looking for peace," Darren said grimly. "Some just want revenge." As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The sunlight seemed to chase away the shadows, banishing the oppressive darkness that had settled over the house. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been gripping the blanket until I finally let it go, my knuckles aching from the strain. "She won't come back now," Darren's mother said, her voice steady but tired. "Not until nightfall." I nodded, though the thought of facing another night filled me with dread. For now, though, I was safe, or so I thought. The rest of the day was a blur. Darren and his mother insisted I stay with them until we could figure out what to do, and I was too shaken to argue. I spent most of the morning sitting by the fire, staring at the photograph of Eleanor and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Darren left around noon, saying he needed to pick up a few things from town. I offered to go with him, but he shook his head. "You're safer here," he said. "I won't be long." I watched him drive away, a knot of anxiety forming in my chest. As much as I trusted Darren, the thought of being left alone, well, alone with his mother, made my stomach churn. Something about the house felt different in the daylight, emptier somehow, as if the shadows had merely retreated to wait for nightfall. "You're doing better than most," Darren's mother said, breaking the silence. She was sitting in her usual spot by the fire, the old journal still open in her lap. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Most people who see her don't make it through the first night," she said. "They panic, they run, and that's when she gets them." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Why me?" I asked. "Why did she pick me?" Darren's mother closed the journal and set it aside. "No one knows," she said. "Maybe you remind her of someone. Maybe you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe—" She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the photograph on the table. "Maybe she's trying to finish something she started a long time ago." "What does that mean?" I asked. But she didn't answer. Instead, she stood and crossed the room to the window, peering out at the dense forest beyond. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground, but there was no sign of movement, no sign of her. "Whatever happens tonight," Darren's mother said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you need to stay strong. Don't let her in. No matter what she says, no matter what she shows you." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "What do you mean, shows me?" But again, she didn't answer. If you made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next chilling story. Who knows? The next one might just keep you up at night.